The morning light crept over Trodaria's jagged mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. Husser watched from his balcony as two enormous winged predators battled in the distance, their screeches echoing across the valley. Just another typical dawn on his homeworld. Trodaria was not a planet for the weak. With gravity nearly twice that of Federation standard, an atmosphere rich in nitrogen compounds that would be toxic to most sentient species, and an ecosystem where even the vegetation had evolved defensive mechanisms capable of killing most off-worlders. It was classified as a death world by the Galactic Federation's Xenobiological Standard Council, and the Trodarians had evolved accordingly. Standing nearly 8 feet tall on their hind legs, with dense musculature, protective scales covering vital areas, and retractable claws that could slice through metal alloys, they were apex predators by any measure. Their respiratory system filtered toxins effortlessly, and their digestive tract could process foods that would kill most sentient beings in minutes. Husser flexed his powerful arms, watching the play of morning light on his emerald scales. As both warrior and temporary diplomatic representative of his species, he took pride in embodying the strength of his race. The Federation meeting on Neuter would be tedious, filled with the usual complaints from herbivore species about predator aggression and intimidation tactics, but it was his duty to attend. Still preening, the amused voice came from behind him. Husser turned to see his sister Hagara entering his chambers. Unlike him, she wore the formal robes of a scientific delegate rather than the partial battle armor he preferred for diplomatic functions. Her scales were a deeper green, almost teal in the morning light, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made her one of Trodaria's leading xenobiologists. "I wasn't preening," he growled, though without real anger. "Just contemplating how impressive you look." Hagara's mandibles clicked in their species equivalent of a smile. "The shuttle leaves in 2 hours. Ysara is already at the spaceport, probably challenging the security droids to strength contests." Husser snorted. His mate was indeed likely doing exactly that. Ysara had the competitive spirit typical of their species, but elevated to an art form. She never missed an opportunity to demonstrate Trodarian superiority, especially in front of other species. "Have you heard the rumors?" Hagara asked, her tone shifting to something more serious as she moved to stand beside him at the balcony. "Which ones?" "The Federation is a rumor mill by design. There's talk of a new species joining, another Deathworlder." Husser's head snapped toward her, his pupils contracting to thin slits in the bright light. "Impossible. No other Federation member comes from a Class 12 biosphere. The Venlaxians claim their homeworld is harsh, but it's barely a Class 9. These aren't Venlaxians. They're called humans, from a planet called Earth. Never heard of them." "Few have. They've been observing the Federation for some time, apparently. This is their first formal introduction." Husser felt an uncomfortable mix of emotions. The Trodarians had long prided themselves on being the only true Deathworlders in the Federation. Their unique status gave them certain privileges and respect that other species didn't enjoy. The idea that another species might claim similar origins was unsettling. "Propaganda," he finally declared. "Some minor species trying to elevate their status. We'll see through it immediately." Hagara's mandibles clicked again, but this time in the pattern that indicated skepticism. "Perhaps. I've requested access to their biological data, but the Federation Council is being unusually secretive." "Which means nothing," Husser said dismissively, turning back to his quarters. "Remember the Polarians? They claimed to be from a high-gravity world until actual measurements proved they exaggerated by nearly 40%. I remember. I also remember you throwing their ambassador across the reception hall to test their adaptation to gravity. A diplomatic incident that was well worth the formal reprimand," Husser said with satisfaction. "Now, shall we prepare for departure? I want to review the trade disputes before we arrive." As he gathered his formal insignia, Husser couldn't completely dismiss the unease that had settled in his gut. The Federation had always been clear. Trodaria was unique, a statistical anomaly in the galaxy's habitable worlds. The idea that there might be another species evolved under similar pressures was more than just surprising. It threatened a core aspect of Trodarian identity. "What does Ysara think of these rumors?" he asked casually. "She wants to meet them and test their claims personally," Hagra replied, mimicking Ysara's aggressive stance perfectly. Of course she did. Husser felt a surge of affection for his mate. At least her reaction was predictable. "And you?" he asked his sister. "What does the scientist think?" Hagra's eyes gleamed. "I am curious. If they truly evolved on a death world, their biological adaptations would be fascinating to study. Convergent evolution across star systems is rare enough, but parallel development of apex predator traits? That would be worthy of extensive research. Your scientific curiosity might have to wait. The Federation Council will have them wrapped in diplomatic protection protocols." "True, but that won't stop us from observing." She paused at the door. "Coming, brother? Our transport awaits." Husser took one last look at the Trodarian landscape, the planet that had forged his species into the powerful beings they were. No other world could be as challenging. No other species could match theirs. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered, "What if?" The journey to Neuter was uneventful, though the Federation transport ship's accommodations were, as always, inadequate for Trodarian physiology. The ceilings were too low, the seats too fragile, and the environmental controls set to a temperature range that left Husser and his companions constantly adjusting their thermal regulation. "One would think," Ysara complained as they prepared for arrival, "that after 2 centuries of Federation membership, they could design a ship that doesn't treat us as an afterthought." She was magnificent even in her irritation, Husser thought, watching her adjust her ceremonial armor. Her scales had the iridescent quality rare among their kind, shifting from emerald to sapphire, depending on the light. She wore her rank markings proudly, the scars of combat and ritual challenge visible along her powerful forearms. "They fear us," Hagra said simply, barely looking up from her datapad. "Fear rarely inspires proper hospitality." "They should fear us," Ysara responded, extending her claws to their full length and examining them critically. "But they should also respect us enough to provide proper accommodations." The ship's intercom announced their imminent arrival at Neuter's main spaceport. Husser moved to the viewport, watching as the Federation's administrative capital came into view. Neuter had been chosen as the Federation's central planet precisely because it was, in many ways, the opposite of worlds like Trodaria. With mild climate, standard gravity, and an atmosphere composed primarily of nitrogen and oxygen with few trace elements. It was habitable for nearly 80% of Federation species without any environmental assistance. Its native flora and fauna were non-aggressive, its tectonic activity minimal. It was, as the Federation Charter described it, optimally inoffensive. The city sprawled beneath them as they descended, a marvel of architectural compromise. Buildings of countless styles stood side by side, connected by transparent tubes where environmental conditions could be adjusted for different species' needs. Floating platforms carried aquatic delegates in mobile water environments. Walking paths for standard atmosphere breathers wound alongside methane chambers for species with different respiratory requirements. It was impressive, Husser had to admit, even if he found it somewhat soft and over-engineered. As they disembarked from the transport, the usual reaction to Trodarian presence immediately became apparent. The crowd in the arrival terminal parted rapidly, creating a wide berth around Husser and his companions. Some species showed the proper deference to apex predators, lowering their various sensory appendages and stepping back. Others simply fled, their fear response triggering despite the strict Federation peace protocols. Ysara strode forward, head high, clearly enjoying the effect. Husser matched her pace, while Hagra followed slightly behind, observing the reactions with scientific detachment. Ambassador Husser, a small, gray-skinned Palaxian official approached, bobbing nervously. "Welcome to Neuter. The council session begins in 3 standard hours. Your delegation's accommodations have been prepared according to Trodarian specifications." "We'll see about that," Ysara muttered, but Husser acknowledged the official with a short nod. "Any items of particular interest on today's agenda?" he asked casually. The Palaxian's large eyes blinked rapidly. The standard trade dispute resolutions, resource allocation agreements. It hesitated, and, of course, the formal introduction of a human delegation. Ysara's head turned sharply. The new Deathworlders? The Palaxian took an involuntary step back. That is, the Earth delegation. Yes, they arrived yesterday. Husser felt a prickle of anticipation. And where are they now? I believe they're being given a tour of the council facilities. If you'll follow me, I'll escort you to your quarters. As they followed the nervous official through the spaceport's massive central concourse, Husser found himself scanning the crowds more intently than usual. What would these humans look like? If they truly came from a high-gravity, high-danger world, they would likely share some physical characteristics with Trodarians: dense musculature, protective external features, efficient predatory adaptations. "There," Hagara said quietly, nodding toward a group near one of the security checkpoints. Husser followed her gaze but was initially confused by what he saw. A small cluster of bipedal beings stood conversing with several Federation security officers. They were tall by Federation standards, though still shorter than Trodarians, and appear to have no scales, no visible claws, and no armored plating. Their skin seemed soft and exposed, in various shades of tan and brown. They had fur on their heads, but nowhere else visible. "Those can't be the humans," he said dismissively. "Look at them. No natural defenses, no apparent adaptations for a harsh environment. They look like prey species." Yet something about them nagged at him. They stood with a certain confidence unusual among the Federation's herbivore species. While they lacked obvious predatory features, there was something in their posture, in the way they gestured and moved, that suggested capability. Most tellingly, the security officers, themselves from moderately challenging worlds, seemed to treat them with cautious respect rather than the protective condescension usually afforded to physically vulnerable species. "Don't be so quick to judge," Hagara said. "Remember the Arcosians? They appear harmless until they reveal their neurotoxin glands." Husser studied the potential humans more carefully. "We'll see." The Palaxian led them to a separate transit tube, explaining that their quarters were in the diplomatic sector. As they moved away from the main concourse, Husser found himself looking back at the strange bipeds, wondering, were these truly Deathworlders? If so, how had such seemingly defenseless creatures survived evolution on a planet that could earn such classification? Most importantly, what would their presence mean for Trodaria's unique standing in the Federation? The Council Chamber of the Galactic Federation was an architectural marvel designed to accommodate hundreds of species simultaneously. The enormous dome-shaped room featured tiered seating arranged in concentric circles, with environmental controls that could be adjusted at each individual station. The center of the chamber held the speaker's platform, currently occupied by a gelatinous Malarian diplomat whose translucent body rippled as it addressed the assembly. Husser, Hagara, and Ysara took their designated places in the predator section, a practical arrangement that kept species with natural prey/predator relationships sufficiently separated to avoid triggering instinctual responses. The Trodarian section was, as usual, generously spaced and isolated from others, with reinforced seating and environmental controls set to their preferred specifications. Another thrilling session of resource allocation debates, Ysara commented dryly as they settled in. "I count 17 different species already showing stress responses to our arrival." Husser scanned the chamber, noting the reactions. The smaller herbivore species indeed seemed unusually tense, with various physiological signs of anxiety visible even from a distance. But their attention wasn't focused solely on the Trodarian delegation. "They're watching another section as well," Hagara observed, following his gaze. On the opposite side of the chamber, in a section typically reserved for omnivore species of moderate threat assessment, a small delegation was being seated. From this distance, Husser could confirm they were indeed the beings they had observed in the spaceport. 5 of them, dressed in formal attire that seemed to serve no protective function whatsoever, were taking their places among the delegates. "Those are the humans." Ysara sounded incredulous. "They look like they'd snap in half under Trodarian gravity." "Appearances can be deceiving," Hagara reminded her. "The Federation classification system doesn't make mistakes about planetary conditions." The session formally opened with the traditional invocation of peace principles, followed by a tedious series of trade dispute presentations. Husser found his attention wandering repeatedly to the human delegation. They seemed to be paying careful attention to the proceedings, occasionally making notes on datapads or conversing quietly among themselves. During a presentation by the Venlaxian trade representative regarding mining rights in the Scorpii sector, a small Jurialian delegate approached the Trodarian section, moving with the deliberate slowness that indicated non-threatening intent. "Ambassador Husser," it spoke softly, its translator rendering its whistling native language into standard Federation speech. "The Scientific Council wished me to convey a message to researcher Hagara." Hagara leaned forward. "I'm listening." "The new species, the humans, they have submitted their biological and planetary data to the Council archives. It has been classified under Security Protocol 7, but as a leading xenobiologist, you have been granted access." Hagara's eyes widened slightly, the most excitement she typically showed in public. "Thank you. I'll review it after the session." The Jurialian bobbed its head and retreated. Husser noticed Ysara watching the interaction with narrowed eyes. "Security Protocol 7, she muttered. "That's the same classification as our own biological data." Husser felt that uncomfortable sensation returning. Protocol 7 was reserved for species whose biological capabilities could pose significant security concerns if fully understood by potential adversaries. It was a tacit admission that the Federation considered these humans to be dangerous. The session droned on, with various species presenting their grievances and proposals. As usual, there were several pointed remarks about aggressive species and the need for stronger safeguards against intimidation tactics, thinly veiled references to Trodarian behavior in previous trade negotiations. Finally, as the session neared its midpoint break, the speaker announced, "We now welcome the official delegation from planet Earth, a newly approved observer state within the Federation. Ambassador Lucas Reynolds will address the council." One of the humans stood and made his way to the central platform. He was tall for his species, with dark skin and close-cropped black hair. He moved with a fluid grace that suggested physical training. "Honorable representatives of the Galactic Federation," he began, his voice translated simultaneously into hundreds of languages throughout the chamber. "I bring greetings from Earth and the United Human Worlds. We are honored to join this august body as observers, and hopeful for future full membership." His speech continued with diplomatic pleasantries, expressions of hope for cooperation, and the standard assurances of peaceful intentions. Nothing in his words was particularly remarkable. It was a standard script for new species introductions. But Husser noted something in the human's demeanor that caught his attention. Unlike many species addressing the council for the first time, there was no hint of awe or intimidation. The human spoke as if addressing equals, with a quiet confidence that bordered on presumption. "We understand that our arrival has generated curiosity," the human continued. "Earth has been classified as what you term a death world, and we recognize this places us in an unusual category among Federation species. We wish to assure the Council that humans have evolved with a deep respect for diversity and cooperation, despite our origins in a challenging environment." A ripple of murmurs spread through the chamber. Several delegates from herbivore species shifted uncomfortably. Did he just casually confirm they're Deathworlders? Ysara whispered incredulously. Husser didn't respond, watching as the human ambassador concluded his address and returned to his delegation amid polite acknowledgments from the council leaders. The speaker announced a recess, and delegates began to rise for the customary mid-session break. Husser turned to his companions. "I want to get a closer look at these humans," he said. "Let's mingle." The central reception area outside the council chamber was already crowded with delegates when the Trodarians entered. As usual, a clear space quickly formed around them as other species instinctively gave them a wide berth. Husser scanned the room, quickly locating the human delegation near one of the refreshment stations. They were surrounded by a small group of curious delegates, primarily from a more adventurous omnivore species. "Let's approach casually," Hagara suggested. "I'd like to observe their reactions." They made their way across the reception area, noting how conversations hushed as they passed. This was standard. Few species were comfortable continuing their discussions in the presence of Trodarians, whether from fear or respect. As they drew nearer to the human group, Husser got his first close look at these supposed Deathworlders. Their physical forms remained unimpressive. No obvious defensive adaptations, no visible weapons beyond what appeared to be purely ceremonial items on their formal attire. Yet there was something in their bearing, a kind of alert readiness despite their seemingly relaxed postures, that struck him as familiar. It was, he realized with surprise, not unlike the watchfulness of Trodarian hunters. The human ambassador, Reynolds, noticed their approach first. He turned, saying something quickly to his companions, and the entire human delegation shifted slightly to face the Trodarians. And then, most surprisingly, Reynolds smiled. It was not the fear grimace Husser was accustomed to seeing from smaller species, nor the stiff, formal acknowledgement of diplomatic equals. It appeared genuine, with no visible stress indicators. "The Trodarian delegation, I presume?" Reynolds spoke first, breaking protocol. Lower-ranked species were expected to wait for acknowledgement from apex predators. "I'm Ambassador Lucas Reynolds. These are my colleagues, Security Specialist Samantha Chun, Science Officer Liana Okafor, and Cultural Attaches Igor Volkov and Maria Diaz." "Correction," Husser said sharply. "The individual you introduced as Samantha Chun will need to be referred to by a different name." He wasn't sure why, but ancestral protocol demanded it. Reynolds looked momentarily confused, then nodded. "Of course. This is Security Specialist Samantha Blackwood." The human female nodded respectfully. "Ambassador." Husser performed the minimal acknowledgement acceptable for a first meeting. "I am Husser, diplomatic representative of Trodaria. My companions are Hagara, scientific advisor, and Ysara, security attaché." The surrounding area had grown quiet, other delegates watching the interaction with undisguised interest. It wasn't every day that two predator species met for the first time, especially when one had just challenged the other's unique status. "We've heard much about the Trodarians," Reynolds continued. "Your reputation as formidable warriors and skilled negotiators precedes you." Ysara's mandibles clicked in the pattern indicating suspicion. "And we've heard almost nothing about humans until recently." "We prefer to observe before engaging," said the human female, Blackwood. Her stance shifted subtly, and Husser noticed for the first time the well-defined musculature visible even beneath her formal attire. "It provides certain advantages. A predator's strategy," Ysara noted, her tone both challenging and approving. "We evolved as pursuit predators," the human named Volkov said. His accent was different from the others, his physique more massive. "Observation, tracking, endurance hunting. Different from your evolutionary path, but effective in Earth's conditions." Hagara's scientific interest was clearly piqued. "Fascinating. I've been granted access to your biological data files. I look forward to reviewing them. And we've studied what's available about Trodarian physiology," said the female scientist, Okafor. "Your adaptations to high gravity and atmospheric toxins are remarkable." The conversation might have continued, but the signal for returning to the council session sounded. Reynolds inclined his head slightly. "Perhaps we could continue this discussion after the session. There's a venue called Everything Tavern that I'm told is popular for unofficial diplomatic exchanges." Husser felt Ysara tensing beside him. She clearly wanted to accept what could be interpreted as a challenge. But protocol demanded caution. "Perhaps," he said noncommittally. "We have other obligations to consider." Reynolds smiled again, seemingly unperturbed by the partial rebuff. "Of course. The invitation stands." As they turned to return to the council chamber, Ysura spoke quietly. We're going to this tavern. I want to see these pursuit predators in a less formal setting. It could be informative, Hagara agreed. They seem intriguing. Husser nodded slowly. Yes, these humans were indeed intriguing. Not physically imposing, yet carrying themselves with the confidence of apex species. Not visibly dangerous, yet classified under the highest security protocols. Most unsettling of all, they seemed entirely comfortable in the presence of Trodarians, a reaction almost unheard of among Federation species encountering them for the first time. Either these humans were foolishly ignorant of the danger Trodarians represented, or they genuinely did not fear them. And that possibility was the most intriguing of all. Everything Tavern had earned its name by attempting to accommodate every possible biochemistry and environmental preference among the Federation's diverse species. The sprawling establishment featured dozens of separate sections, each with atmosphere, gravity, temperature, and chemical composition tailored to specific biological needs. The central area, maintained at Federation standard conditions, served as a neutral meeting ground where species with compatible requirements could gather. Specialized refreshments were delivered through an elaborate system of transporters and containment fields that prevented cross-contamination. Husser, Hagara, and Ysura arrived shortly after the council session had concluded. The tavern was already filling with delegates seeking relaxation after the day's diplomatic formalities. As usual, the Trodarians' entrance caused a visible ripple of reaction. Conversations paused, species shifted away, security drones adjusted their positions slightly. The usual warm welcome, Ysura commented, sardonically as they made their way toward the predator section. One might think we'd eaten a delegate in public. There was that incident with the Polarian, Hagara reminded her. Though technically you only threatened to eat him. He questioned Trodarian honor. He deserved worse. They settled at a reinforced table designed to withstand predator species strength. A service drone approached, its optical sensors adjusting as it scanned their biological signatures. Welcome, honored Trodarian delegates, it intoned. Would you prefer refreshments from your homeworld catalog or Federation standard offerings? Kari Spirit, Ysura ordered instantly. The strongest available. The same, Husser agreed. After a day of diplomatic tedium, the potent Trodarian alcoholic beverage would be welcome. Water for me, Hagara said. I have data to review later. As the drone departed, Husser surveyed the tavern. Species segregated themselves naturally, with herbivores clustering in large, defensive groups, omnivores mixing more freely, and the few predator species claiming separate territories within the space. And then he spotted them. The human delegation had indeed come to Everything Tavern, currently being escorted to a section typically reserved for omnivores of moderate threat assessment. They were conversing animatedly, seemingly at ease in the diverse environment. There they are, Ysura said, her eyes narrowing. Drinking something, foamy and yellow. Hagara followed her gaze. A fermented beverage, I believe. Their biological data indicated they can process alcohol, though their tolerance is supposedly quite high for their body mass. Is that a challenge? Ysura's mandibles clicked in amusement. Everything is a challenge to you, Husser said, but without criticism. It was a trait he valued in his mate. The service drone returned with their drinks. Husser took a long swallow of the Kari, feeling the familiar burn as the potent liquid scalded its way down his throat. Trodarian biochemistry processed alcohol differently than most species. It heightened certain senses while dulling others, an evolutionary adaptation that had once helped their ancestors hunt during Trodaria's toxic night cycles. They're watching us, Hagara noted quietly. She was right. The human called Blackwood had positioned herself to keep the Trodarian table in her line of sight. It was subtly done, but the trained awareness of a security specialist was apparent to those who knew what to look for. Good, Ysura said, raising her glass slightly in the human's direction. I want them to see this. With deliberate showmanship, she downed her entire Kari in one continuous swallow, a feat that would have immediately incapacitated most Federation species. To Husser's surprise, The human Blackwood smiled, leaned over to say something to her companions, and then raised her own glass in return before taking a substantial drink. Did she just acknowledge the challenge? Hagar sounded both amused and concerned. She did, Ysara said with delight. Husser, I believe we should join them. For diplomatic reasons, of course. Husser hesitated. Federation etiquette was complex regarding predator-species interactions. Technically, as the established members, Trodarians would be expected to extend any invitation. But the humans had already broken protocol once today. Very well, he decided. For diplomacy, they made their way across the tavern, noting how conversations hushed as they passed. The herbivore species pressed closer together, some activating personal shields. Even the tavern security drones subtly adjusted their positions. The human delegation watched their approach with interest, but without visible concern. Ambassador Reynolds stood as they neared, a gesture of respect in many cultures. Ambassador Husser, he greeted, we're honored you decided to join us. Please be seated. The table was designed for standard Federation physiology, meaning it was barely adequate for Trodarian frame. Husser sat carefully, aware of the creaking protests from the material. We should request reinforced seating, Hagar murmured. No need to trouble yourselves, said the human Volkov, his accent distinctive. It's good to adapt sometimes, yes? Shows flexibility. Ysara's eyes narrowed slightly at what could be interpreted as a subtle challenge, but she said nothing. We were just discussing the differences between Federation standard alcoholic beverages and Earth varieties, Reynolds said smoothly. Your Vkari spirit has quite the reputation among those few species who can tolerate it. Most Federation species lack the proper enzymes to process it without organ failure, Hagara explained. It contains compounds similar to toxins found in Trodaria's atmosphere. Fascinating. The human scientist Okafor leaned forward. Earth's microbial life also produces numerous toxins that humans have adapted to consume. Some of our most prized beverages were originally discovered when food preservation failed. You eat spoiled food deliberately? Ysara sounded both disgusted and impressed. Controlled spoilage, Blackwood clarified with a smile. Cheese, yogurt, alcoholic fermentation, all technically controlled rot. We've turned poison into pleasure. A trait of predators, Husser observed, finding advantage in danger. Indeed, Reynolds signaled to a passing service drone. Perhaps a demonstration is in order. Could we have a selection of Earth beverages? The variety pack authorized by Federation Biosecurity. As the drone departed, Ysara leaned forward. I notice your acknowledgement of my challenge, security specialist. Blackwood's smile widened. Where I come from, refusing a toast is considered poor manners. And what is this drink you consume? Beer. Specifically, a type called Imperial Stout. High alcohol content by human standards, though I suspect it would barely register for Trodarian physiology. The service drone returned with a container that opened to reveal several bottles of various shapes and colors. Reynolds selected one, pouring amber liquid into glasses for each of them. Beer is one of our oldest beverages, he explained. This variety is relatively mild, about 5% alcohol by volume. Ysara looked at the small glass skeptically. This is what you consider intoxicating. For most humans, several of these would be required for significant effect, Reynolds acknowledged. But we have stronger options. Husser examined the liquid, noting its clarity and carbonation. His olfactory receptors detected complex organic compounds, fermentation byproducts, and indeed a small percentage of ethanol alcohol. Nothing that would challenge Trodarian metabolism. To new diplomatic relations, Reynolds proposed, raising his glass. The Trodarians followed the gesture, and Husser took an experimental sip of the human beverage. The taste was surprisingly complex, bitter yet with sweet undertones, the carbonation creating an interesting texture against his palate. Not unpleasant, he acknowledged, though exceedingly mild. Ysara, predictably, downed her entire glass in one swallow. Barely detectable, she declared. Do you have something stronger? Blackwood and Volkov exchanged amused glances. We thought you might ask, Blackwood said, selecting another bottle from the container. This one contained clear liquid and bore warning symbols in Federation standard. This, she explained as she poured small measures into fresh glasses, is what we call vodka. Approximately 40% alcohol by volume, distilled rather than fermented. Ysara took the offered glass immediately, watching as Blackwood poured one for herself as well. Without hesitation, both females downed the contents simultaneously. Husser had to admit to being faintly impressed when the human showed no immediate distress. Most species would be displaying significant intoxication symptoms from such concentrated alcohol. Better, Ysara declared, though still quite mild compared to Kari. We're just getting started, Volkov said with a rumbling laugh. On my family's farm in Russia, we make samagon, what you might call moonshine. Special recipe, 70% alcohol. Burns like fire. From across the tavern, Husser noticed they were drawing attention. Several herbivore species were watching with obvious concern as predator species engaged in what appeared to be a drinking contest. Even some of the tavern security drones had reoriented toward their table. Perhaps we should moderate our consumption, Hagara suggested quietly. We are still formal representatives. Nonsense, Ysara countered. This is exactly the kind of diplomatic exchange that builds real understanding between species. Reynolds seemed to share her view. Security specialist Blackwood has enhanced metabolic filtration from her military modifications, he explained. And attaché Volkov comes from a cultural tradition where alcohol tolerance is a point of pride. As does Ysara, Husser said dryly. Over the next hour, the impromptu competition escalated. The humans produced increasingly potent beverages from their authorized collection, while Ysara arranged for progressively stronger versions of Kari to be delivered from the Trodarian reserves. To Husser's surprise, the humans held their own remarkably well. While they showed some signs of intoxication, increased volume, slight motor imprecision, they remained functional far beyond what should have been possible given their body mass and apparent lack of specialized detoxification organs. Even more surprisingly, the conversation flowed with increasing ease. The usual barriers of diplomatic formality eroded, and they found themselves discussing everything from hunting techniques to philosophical views on the Federation structure. The problem, Reynolds was saying, having moved to sit closer to Husser, is that the Federation's founding species were primarily herbivores and passive omnivores. The entire legal and social framework is built around their evolutionary psychology. Fear-based cooperation, Husser agreed, finding himself genuinely engaged in the discussion. Defense against predation as the primary motivator for social organization. Exactly, Reynolds tapped the table emphatically. But that's not the only valid model for civilization. Humans formed cooperative groups, initially for more effective hunting, not just defense. As did ancient Trodarians, Hagara contributed. The scientist had eventually abandoned her water in favor of mild stimulants, though she remained the most sober of their group. Our oldest cave paintings show group hunting strategies. Trodarian art? The human female Diaz spoke up for the first time, her interest evident. I'd love to see examples. Cultural exchange is my specialty. Ysara had progressed to sharing war stories with Blackwood and Volkov, the three security specialists finding common ground in combat experiences despite their physiological differences. So there I was, Volkov was saying, gesturing broadly, surrounded by 3 Centaurian mercenaries, gravity generator failing, and only a broken shuttle strut as a weapon. And you expect us to believe you defeated all 3? Ysara challenged, though her translator conveyed amusement rather than disbelief. Not defeated, Volkov corrected with a grin. Outlasted. Humans don't always win through strength. Sometimes we win through sheer stubbornness. I kept them chasing me through the damaged sections until their environmental suits failed. No killing needed. Ysara clicked her mandibles appreciatively. Resourceful, though I would have preferred a more direct approach. Different evolutionary pressures, Blackwood explained, pouring another round of a dark liquid she called whiskey. Humans evolved as persistence hunters. We're not the strongest or fastest, but we can keep going long after other species collapse from exhaustion. Husserl found this concept intriguing. Troodarians were ambush predators by evolutionary design, their strength and speed allowing for quick, decisive kills. The idea of chasing prey to exhaustion seemed inefficient, yet clearly it had produced a successful apex species. The atmosphere in the tavern had shifted as the evening progressed. What had begun as tense observation of two predator species in proximity had evolved into something of a spectacle. Other delegates had gradually moved closer, watching the unprecedented sight of Troodarians and humans engaged in seemingly friendly competition. Hagara was deep in conversation with Okafor about biochemical adaptation pathways when the incident began. A group of Melborian delegates, herbivores known for their nervous temperament and herd mentality, had been consuming their own intoxicants at a nearby table. As the evening progressed, their natural fear of predator species had apparently transformed into liquid courage. "Look at them," one Melborian said loudly enough to be heard, its translator not quite masking the contemptuous tone. Predators bonding over violence and poison. Husserl noticed Ysara's attention shift immediately, her predator instincts locking onto the potential threat. Blackwood, too, had subtly altered her posture, though her expression remained neutral. "It's disgusting," another Melborian continued, encouraged by the first. "They think because they can kill, they deserve special treatment." "Ignore them," Hagara advised quietly. Intoxicated herbivores posturing for their herd. Not worth the diplomatic incident. Reynolds nodded agreement. They're just trying to provoke a reaction. But the Melborians weren't finished. Their group had grown larger as other herbivore species joined them, finding solidarity in their shared grievances. "The Troodarians have bullied the Federation for centuries," the apparent leader declared, swaying slightly. "And now, these humans think they can join the intimidation game? We outnumber you predators. We always have." Ysara's eyes narrowed to slits, and Husserl could see her claws beginning to extend, an automatic response to threat that would be difficult for her to suppress in her current intoxicated state. "Perhaps we should relocate," he suggested, aware that the situation was deteriorating. "Running from herbivores?" Ysara hissed. "Never." The tension might have dissipated naturally, but the Melborian leader chose that moment to make a critical mistake. Emboldened by numbers and chemical courage, it grabbed a container of foul-smelling liquid from its table and hurled it toward the predators. The projectile sailed through the air with surprising accuracy, splattering across Ysara's ceremonial armor and Blackwood's formal uniform simultaneously. For a heartbeat, absolute silence fell over everything tavern. Then, several things happened in rapid succession. Ysara erupted from her seat with a roar that activated every alarm system in the establishment. Her claws extended to full combat length, her scales flaring in the threat display that had terrified countless species across the galaxy. Security drones converged instantly, weapon systems powering up. And Samantha Blackwood, covered in the same noxious liquid, did something entirely unexpected. She laughed. The sound cut through the chaos, so incongruous that it momentarily froze everyone, including Ysara. "Really?" Blackwood said, wiping the substance from her face with apparent unconcern. "That's your big move? Throwing drinks." She stood, far more steadily than anyone who had consumed that much alcohol should be able to, and faced the now-retreating Melborians. "Where I come from, this is how bar fights start. But they usually involve a fair challenge first, not a cheap shot from across the room." The Melborian leader stammered something about predator aggression and Federation regulations, but its herd was already dispersing, suddenly remembering the very real danger they had provoked. The moment might have ended there, with nothing more than wounded pride, had another herbivore species, the Jury aliens, not chosen that moment to join the fray. "Federation security will put you predators in your place," one shouted, and hurled a heavy metal container that struck Volkov squarely in the face. Blood, bright red, so different from Troodarian blue-green, trickled from a cut above the human's eye. He touched it, looked at the blood on his fingers, and sighed heavily. "Now we have problem," he said calmly. What happened next would later be described in Federation security reports as a multi-species altercation resulting from cultural misunderstanding. In reality, it was the most impressive bar fight Neuter had ever witnessed. The Herbivore Alliance, finding courage in numbers, launched a coordinated attack. Containers, furniture, and even small decorative plants became projectiles aimed at both humans and Trodarians. Ysara's combat training took over instantly. She flipped the reinforced table to create cover, then launched herself at the nearest attackers with terrifying speed. Her goal wasn't to kill. Even intoxicated, she maintained enough control to use non-lethal techniques. But the herbivores didn't know that as she sent them flying with precisely calculated strikes. The humans, remarkably, moved with similar purpose. Despite their lack of natural weapons, they demonstrated combat effectiveness that belied their seemingly vulnerable physiology. Blackwood moved with fluid grace, intercepting projectiles and redirecting attackers with techniques that used their own momentum against them. Volkov, despite the blood still flowing from his wound, became a juggernaut, lifting a Jurielian bodily and using it as a shield before depositing it none too gently into a decorative water feature. Most surprisingly to Husser, Reynolds, a diplomatic officer, dropped into a fighting stance alongside his security team, moving with a coordinated precision that spoke of military training. "Ambassador," Husser called out, deflecting a chair thrown by a particularly bold Centaurian. "This isn't your responsibility." "On Earth," Reynolds shouted back, executing a perfect throw that sent his attacker tumbling. Diplomats learned to handle themselves in difficult situations. The Federation security drones were attempting to contain the situation, but their programming prevented them from directly engaging with diplomatic representatives. They could only create containment fields and issue increasingly urgent warnings about violations of peace protocols. Hagara and Okafor had taken a different approach, using portable field generators to create a defensive perimeter around civilians not involved in the conflict. The two scientists worked with calm efficiency, proving that intellectual species could still respond effectively to chaos. As the fight intensified, Husser found himself fighting back-to-back with Lucas Reynolds. The human might lack claws and armor, but he moved with surprising strength and speed. His techniques adapted to leverage the strongest parts of human physiology. "Is it always like this when Trodarians visit?" Reynolds asked, ducking under a wild swing from a Palaxian attacker before delivering a precise counterstrike. "Usually they keep their distance," Husser replied, using his armored forearm to block an improvised weapon. "This is unprecedented." "I'd call it progress," Reynolds said with a grin. "They're treating us as equals, equally threatening. That is." The observation was so unexpected that Husser barked out a laugh, a sound rarely heard from Trodarians in public. The human was right. The Herbivore Alliance wasn't distinguishing between their species. They had lumped humans and Trodarians together as dangerous predators to be confronted. It was perversely a form of recognition. Ysara and Blackwood had formed their own impromptu alliance, covering each other's biological weaknesses. When a Centaurian attempted to use a sonic disruptor, particularly effective against Trodarian auditory systems, Blackwood destroyed the device with a well-aimed projectile. When attackers tried to swarm Blackwood with superior numbers, Ysara's greater reach and strength cleared a space around them both. The fight lasted perhaps 5 minutes before Federation security reinforcements arrived in sufficient numbers to establish a full containment field throughout the tavern. The field damped kinetic energy, effectively preventing further physical confrontation. "This gathering is terminated by order of Federation Security Council," announced the chief security drone. "All diplomatic representatives will return to their assigned quarters for identification and statement processing." Husser surveyed the aftermath. The tavern was in ruins, furniture shattered, decorative elements destroyed, various fluids coating nearly every surface. Several herbivore species lay groaning on the floor, though none appeared seriously injured. The Trodarians had maintained enough control to avoid lethal force, and the humans had shown similar restraint. Well, Reynolds said, straightening his torn formal attire. That was enlightening. Ysara approached, her scales still partially flared, but her combat stance relaxed. The humans fight well, she declared, the highest compliment a Trodarian warrior could offer, especially for a species with no natural weapons. We compensate with technique and determination, Blackwood replied, wiping blood, both hers and others, from her knuckles. Though I admit, having claws would be useful. Security drones were beginning to escort delegates from the tavern, prioritizing the injured for medical attention. We should leave before they process us officially, Hagara suggested, rejoining the group with Okafor. The diplomatic complications from this incident will be significant. Agreed, Reynolds said. I know a place we can decompress while this gets sorted out, if you're willing to trust us. Husser exchanged glances with his companions. Federation protocol demanded they submit to security processing. But something more important was happening here. A connection between species that transcended formal diplomacy. Lead the way, Ambassador, he decided. I believe we have much to discuss. They slipped out through a service corridor as Federation security focused on containing the more combative delegates. The humans moved with surprising stealth for their size, adapting quickly to the need for discretion. The diplomatic quarter of Neuter was designed with numerous gardens and meditation spaces, intended to provide neutral ground for species with compatible atmospheric requirements. Reynolds led them to a secluded garden dome, accessible through his diplomatic credentials, where they could speak privately. The artificial sky above simulated early evening, with programmed stars beginning to appear. Vegetation from dozens of worlds created natural privacy screens throughout the space. A small water feature provided both ambient sound and a guarantee against surveillance devices, which couldn't function properly near moving water on Neuter. That, Volkov declared as they settled into a secluded area, was most interesting diplomatic reception I have ever attended. Is that what we're calling a bar brawl now? Blackwood asked, examining a bruise forming on her forearm. A diplomatic reception, in a way it was, Hagara observed thoughtfully, more honest than most official functions. Husser found himself agreeing. The chaotic fight had revealed more about human capabilities than hours of formal discussion could have. They were indeed formidable, not in the same way as Trodarians, but effective nonetheless. Your combat techniques, Ysara said, addressing Blackwood directly. They're adapted to compensate for your physical limitations. Impressive. We've had to be creative, Blackwood acknowledged. Humans are the strongest or most naturally armed species on Earth. We learned to use leverage, momentum, and precision instead of raw power. Yet you clearly possess significant strength for your frame, Husser noted. More than would be expected from your apparent musculature. Dense muscle fiber, efficient oxygen use, and biomechanical advantages in our skeletal structure, Okafor explained. Plus, Earth's gravity is approximately 1.1 Federation standard. Not as challenging as Trodaria's, but enough to develop respectable strength. And your reflexes, Ysara continued, clearly still assessing the human's combat potential. Faster than most Federation species. Evolved for hunting and survival in diverse threat environments, Reynolds said. Earth has everything from microscopic parasites to apex predators that would consider humans prey. We adapted to all of it, as did we, Husser said, though Trodaria's challenges are more consistent in their lethality. The conversation paused as they consider their situation. Two apex species from different worlds, now fugitives from Federation security after participating in the diplomatic equivalent of a tavern brawl. It should have been tense, even hostile. Instead, Husser felt an unexpected sense of kinship. The herbivores grouped us together, he observed. They see no difference between humans and Trodarians. Reynolds nodded. Fear doesn't discriminate. To them, we're just different versions of the same threat. But we're not, Hagara pointed out. Our evolutionary paths, while both producing apex species, are quite different, which makes our shared status all the more interesting, Okafor said. Convergent evolution across star systems, developing such different approaches to the same fundamental challenges. You said humans evolved as persistence hunters, Husserl recalled, addressing Blackwood. Explain. Early humans couldn't match the speed or strength of our prey, she replied. So we developed endurance. We would literally chase animals until they collapsed from heat exhaustion. Human thermoregulation, our ability to cool through sweating while continuing to move, is almost unique among Earth species. While Troodarians evolved as ambush predators, Haggara added. Maximum force applied in minimum time to minimize exposure to Troodaria's ambient toxins. Different solutions to different planetary challenges, Reynolds said. Yet both produced intelligent, tool-using apex species that eventually reached the stars. And both ended up classified as Deathworlders by a galactic community dominated by herbivores, Ysara noted with a click of her mandibles. Perhaps we're not so different in the ways that matter. The implication hung in the air between them. Two predator species, both marginalized in their own ways by a federation built on herbivore psychology and priorities. What happens when Federation security processes everyone from the tavern? Husserl asked, returning to practical matters. Best case? Formal reprimands, diplomatic warnings, Reynolds replied. Worst case? They use this as an excuse to impose additional restrictions on dangerous species like ours. They've been looking for justification to limit Troodarian influence for decades, Haggara confirmed. This incident plays into existing prejudices. Volkov snorted. Is always the same, yes? Those who fear what they do not understand seek to control it instead. So what do we do? Blackwood asked, looking between her human colleagues and the Troodarians. Submit to processing and accept whatever diplomatic consequences follow. That would be the proper protocol, Husserl acknowledged. Then, surprising himself, but perhaps not the right answer. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Ambassador Husserl, are you suggesting we consider options outside official channels? I'm suggesting, Husserl said carefully, that two species with our particular capabilities might have more to gain from direct alliance than from allowing the Federation bureaucracy to define our relationship. The atmosphere shifted subtly as the implications of his statement sank in. What he was proposing wasn't illegal under Federation law, but it skirted dangerously close to the kind of unilateral action that made the Council nervous. En alliance, Reynolds répétait toute folie. Between humans and Troodarians. Think of the scientific exchange possibilities alone, Haggara said, her usual reserve giving way to excitement. Two apex species with complementary adaptations and technologies. Combined security capabilities, Ysara added. Troodarian strength with human tactical flexibility. And a unified diplomatic voice, Reynolds concluded. Harder to dismiss or marginalize two Deathworld species speaking as one on Federation policies. Husserl watched the humans closely. In Federation politics, predator species were expected to compete for influence, not cooperate. What he was suggesting represented a significant deviation from established patterns. This won't make us popular with the Council, Blackwood pointed out. We're already not popular, Volkov replied with a shrug. At least this way, we're not popular together. Before we go further, Reynolds said, his expression growing serious, there's something you should know about humanity. He glanced at his colleagues, receiving small nods of agreement. Something not included in our official biological data. Husserl tensed slightly, unsure what revelation could be significant enough to warrant such gravity. Go on. The Federation classifies Earth as a death world primarily because of its ecosystem diversity, gravity, and atmospheric composition, Reynolds began. But those aren't the factors that truly made humans apex predators. Earth looks relatively benign on initial scans, Okafor continued. But its real danger lies in its microscopic life. Viruses, bacteria, parasites. Earth has millions of species that have been locked in evolutionary arms races with larger organisms for billions of years. This created constant selection pressure, Blackwood added. Our immune systems evolved to be hyper-aggressive, constantly adapting to new threats. The practical implication, Reynolds concluded, is that humans are walking biohazards to most Federation species. Our breath, our skin cells, our bodily fluids, all contain microorganisms that could devastate unprepared biological systems. Husserl absorbed this information with growing understanding. That's why you maintain physical distance from most species. Not out of fear, out of concern for their safety. Exactly, Reynolds confirmed. We're carriers for countless organisms that don't harm us, but could be lethal to others. The Federation Council knows this, which is partly why they've been cautious about our integration. Trodarians face similar issues, Hagara revealed, exchanging a significant look with Husserl. Our homeworld's toxic atmosphere has integrated certain compounds into our biology. Our blood, our exhalations, all contain trace elements poisonous to most Federation species. So we're both dangerous, Blackwood said, even when we're not trying to be. Yet another similarity, Ysara noted. The Federation fears what it cannot control. But we can control it, Okafor pointed out. Humans have developed extensive protocols for preventing cross-contamination. With proper precautions, we pose minimal risk. As have Trodarians, Hagara agreed. The difference is in perception. The Federation sees our biological nature as inherently threatening, regardless of our actions or intentions. A contemplative silence fell over the group as they processed these revelations. Husserl found himself reevaluating everything he thought he knew about interspecies relations within the Federation. The herbivore majority hadn't just been reacting to predator psychology. They had legitimate biological reasons to maintain distance. Yet that distance had calcified into prejudice, assumptions, and restrictive policies that limited both Trodarian and, apparently, human potential within the galactic community. So, Reynolds said finally, what do we do about our current situation? Federation security is undoubtedly looking for us by now. We face it, Husserl decided, together, but on our terms. What do you suggest? Blackwood asked. A joint hearing, Husserl proposed. We demand to present a unified account of what happened. We bring evidence. The tavern's security recordings will show the herbivores initiated the conflict. And we use the incident to address the broader issue. Reynolds caught on immediately. The systemic bias against predator species within Federation structures. It's risky, Hagara cautioned. The Council doesn't respond well to being challenged directly, but they respond even worse to embarrassment, Ysara pointed out. If we present a united front with clear evidence, they'll have to acknowledge the truth or lose credibility. Volkov grinned. I like this plan. Is bold, direct. Very human. Very Trodarian too, it seems. Then we're agreed? Reynolds asked, looking around at both human and Trodarian faces. We face this together, as the beginning of a broader alliance between our species. Husserl considered the implications carefully. This went beyond a simple diplomatic cooperation. It represented a fundamental shift in how Trodarians approach galactic politics. For centuries, they had maintained their unique status, keeping other species at a distance. Embracing an alliance with humans meant acknowledging they were not alone in the galaxy as Deathworlders. It meant sharing that identity, that pride. He looked at Hagara, who nodded slightly, her scientific curiosity overcoming traditional caution. He turned to Ysara, who clicked her mandibles in the pattern that signified eager agreement. We are agreed, Husserl declared. The first formal alliance between Deathworld species in Federation history begins now. Reynolds extended his hand, a human gesture of agreement. After a moment's hesitation, Husserl extended his much larger, clawed hand in return. They clasped forearms in the traditional Trodarian manner, adapted to accommodate the human's more fragile bone structure. To new beginnings, Reynolds said, and to showing the Federation a united front they never expected, Husserl added. As if on cue, the Garden Dome's entrance panel slid open, revealing a contingent of Federation security drones and officers. Diplomatic representatives of Earth and Trodaria, announced the lead officer, a Zentorian with the distinctive insignia of Federation Internal Security. You are required to appear before an emergency session of the Security Council regarding the incident at Everything Tavern. Reynolds and Husser exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Then, without releasing their clasped arms, they turned to face the security contingent together. We would be happy to attend, Reynolds replied smoothly. As a joint delegation, the Zentorian blinked its 4 eyes in confusion. That's not standard procedure. Perhaps it should be, Husser said. Lead the way, officer. The human and Trodarian delegations will follow together. As they moved to join the security contingent, Ysara fell into step beside Blackwood, their postures unconsciously mirroring each other. Think they're ready for this? The human security specialist asked quietly. Ysara's mandibles clicked in amusement. Not even slightly. Good, Blackwood replied with a grin. I like keeping them off balance. The emergency session of the Federation Security Council had been hastily convened in one of the smaller chambers of the Central Administration Building. Unlike the Grand Council chamber, this room was designed for confidential hearings and sensitive diplomatic matters. The 7-member Security Council represented the major power blocks within the Federation: 2 herbivore representatives, 2 omnivores, 1 predator, traditionally a Venlaxian, and 2 from specialized environmental categories. They sat in a semicircle behind a raised bench, their various physiologies accommodated by customized seating. The chamber was already crowded when the human and Trodarian delegations arrived. Representatives from species involved in the tavern incident filled the observer sections, many still showing signs of the altercation. Medical drones hovered near those with more serious injuries. Most notably, the Melborian and Jurilian delegations occupied prominent positions, their diplomatic aides busily presenting data to council staffers. They had clearly arrived early to establish their narrative of events. A ripple of reactions spread through the chamber as the humans and Trodarians entered, not separately, as would be expected, but as a unified group. Husser noted the surprised expressions, the whispered comments, the subtle shifting of positions as various species reassessed the situation. The Council recognizes the Earth and Trodaria delegations, announced the Chief Counselor, a Polarian with a mottled skin coloration that indicated advanced age. You are here to address the serious breach of peace protocols that occurred at Everything Tavern approximately 2 standard hours ago. Reynolds stepped forward, with Husser deliberately matching his position rather than standing separately as protocol would dictate. Honored counselors, Reynolds began, we appreciate the opportunity to address this unfortunate incident. Before formal statements, Husser continued seamlessly, we request that the Council review the security recordings from the tavern. They will provide objective context for the events in question. The Polarian skin shifted to a deeper blue, an indication of surprise or annoyance. The recordings are being processed as evidence. Preliminary reports from witnesses indicate that predator species initiated hostilities. With respect, Counselor, Reynolds replied, those preliminary reports are inaccurate. The recordings will show clearly that the Melborian delegation initiated the physical confrontation by throwing a container of fluid at diplomatic representatives. The Melborian ambassador rose immediately, its thin limbs trembling with emotion. This is an outrageous distortion. We were threatened by the predator species' aggressive display. Drinking beverages at a designated refreshment establishment constitutes an aggressive display. Ysara asked, her tone deceptively casual. The chamber erupted into multiple overlapping arguments, with various species shouting accusations and counterclaims. The Council security drones emitted calming harmonic tones designed to reduce tension with minimal effect. Silence. The Chief Counselor's amplified voice cut through the chaos. This is precisely the kind of disorder that peace protocols are designed to prevent. Once relative quiet had been restored, he continued, we will review the security recordings. Until then, all delegations will refrain from unsupported accusations. A large display field activated in the center of the chamber, showing multiple angles of everything tavern prior to the incident. The recordings have been synchronized and enhanced, providing clear views of all relevant parties. For the next several minutes, the council and all present watched the events unfold exactly as they had occurred. The initially separate seating of humans and Trodarians, their eventual joining of tables, the drinking competition, and the increasingly agitated behavior of the herbivore species in proximity. Most importantly, the recordings clearly showed the Melborian representative throwing the first projectile, followed by the jury alien's more serious attack that had drawn human blood. When the display ended, the chamber remained silent for several heartbeats. The recordings appear to support the human and Trodarian account, the Venlaxian council member finally stated. The herbivore delegations initiated physical hostilities. They were provoked, insisted the jury alien representative. The predators were engaging in intimidation tactics, displaying aggressive consumption patterns. We were having drinks, Blackwood interrupted flatly. That's what the establishment is for. The consumption of intoxicants by predator species constitutes a clear threat to herbivore security, the Melborian ambassador insisted. Their lowered inhibitions create an unacceptable risk of predatory behavior. Interesting, Hagara observed. By that logic, should herbivore species be prohibited from consuming aggression-enhancing substances? The biochemical analysis of the beverage you were consuming shows significant levels of compounds that increase territoriality and confrontational behavior in your species. The Melborian had no immediate response to this point. The chief counselor's skin had shifted to a more neutral green tone. The council must consider the broader implications of this incident. While the recordings establish the sequence of events, they also highlight a concerning development. He fixed his gaze on Reynolds and Husser. The apparent alliance between Earth and Trodarian representatives presents potential security considerations for the Federation. And there it was, the real concern underlying the council's hasty convening. Not the tavern brawl itself, but what it represented, cooperation between Deathworld species. The Federation Charter explicitly encourages diplomatic and cultural exchange between member species, Reynolds pointed out. There is no regulation against specific bilateral relationships. True, conceded one of the herbivore counselors, but predator species have historically maintained separation from each other to prevent destabilizing concentrations of potential aggression. An unwritten expectation, not a formal requirement, Husser countered. Perhaps it should become formal, the Melborian ambassador suggested. This incident demonstrates the dangers when predator species collaborate. Husser felt a surge of indignation, but before he could respond, Reynolds placed a hand lightly on his arm, a human gesture requesting patience. The touch was surprising, both in its familiarity and in Husser's lack of instinctive adverse reaction to it. Counselors, Reynolds said, his voice taking on a more formal diplomatic tone, I believe we're at risk of missing an important opportunity here. What you're witnessing isn't a threat to Federation security. It's a demonstration of exactly the kind of cross-species cooperation the Federation was founded to promote. Cooperation that resulted in significant property damage and multiple injuries, the chief counselor pointed out dryly. Cooperation that prevented a much worse outcome, Husser countered. The recordings clearly show that both humans and Trodarians exercised restraint. Had either species responded with full combat capabilities, the herbivore delegations would have suffered far more serious consequences for their attack. This blunt statement caused an uncomfortable shifting among the council members, who knew it to be true. Furthermore, Hagara added, stepping forward with a data pad, I've compiled a statistical analysis of incidents involving Trodarian delegates over the past 50 standard years. The frequency of physical confrontations has been consistently higher when Trodarians are isolated among non-predator species than when interacting with species of similar ecological classification. Okafor joined her, presenting additional data. Human psychological studies from Earth show similar patterns. Apex species often demonstrate reduced aggressive behavior when among peers than when forced to constantly maintain dominance displays among non-threatening groups. The council members exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for this level of coordinated presentation. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked the Venlaxian counselor. Reynolds looked at Husser, who nodded slightly. They had discussed this during their brief private conference in the Garden Dome and agreed on the approach. "We propose a formal recognition of the Earth-Troderia Cooperative Exchange Initiative," Reynolds stated. "A bilateral program focusing on scientific, cultural, and security collaboration between our species. With full transparency to the Federation Council," Husser added, "and adherence to all existing Federation protocols." But with the understanding, Reynolds continued, that Deathworld species have unique perspectives and contributions that have been historically undervalued in Federation policy. The council chamber buzzed with murmurs as the implications were considered. The Melborian and Jurialian representatives looked dismayed, but many of the other species present showed signs of interest or cautious approval. The chief counselor conferred briefly with his colleagues before addressing the chamber again. "This proposal requires formal consideration beyond the scope of this emergency session. For now, regarding the incident at Everything Tavern, based on the evidence presented, the council finds that while all parties share some responsibility for the escalation of hostilities, the herbivore delegations must accept primary accountability for initiating physical confrontation." The Melborian ambassador deflated visibly, while the Jurialian representative clicked its mouth parts in obvious displeasure. "The Earth and Troderian delegations will submit to standard biological decontamination protocols and provide formal statements for the record," the chief counselor continued. "No further punitive measures are deemed necessary at this time." He paused, his skin shifting through several colors before settling on a formal purple. "As for the proposed Cooperative Exchange Initiative, the Council will require a detailed framework document before considering official recognition. However, we cannot prevent voluntary association between Federation members and observer states. It wasn't formal approval, but it was tacit acknowledgement, and for the traditionally conservative Security Council, that represented significant progress. As the session was formally concluded, delegates began to disperse. The Melborian and Jurialian representatives departed quickly, avoiding further interaction with either humans or Troderians. A successful outcome, Reynolds observed quietly as they exited the chamber. Not perfect, but a foundation to build upon. Indeed, Husser agreed, though I suspect the real work begins now. The human ambassador smiled. Isn't that always the case? First contact is dramatic, but it's the relationship building afterward that truly matters. They walked together through the corridors of the administration building, now largely empty in the late hours of Neuter's artificial cycle. The human and Troderian groups remained integrated, with Hagara and Okafor deep in scientific discussion, Ysara and Blackwood comparing combat techniques, and Volkov engaging Diaz in an animated conversation about cultural exchange possibilities. "I must admit," Husser said as they approached the exit, "when I first heard rumors of another Deathworld species joining the Federation, I was concerned." "Threatened?" Reynolds suggested with a raised eyebrow. "Perhaps," Husser acknowledged. "Troderians have defined ourselves by our unique status for generations. The idea that we might not be so unique was unsettling." "Humans had a similar experience," Reynolds revealed. "Throughout our history, we believed ourselves to be the apex species of our world. Learning that the galaxy contained beings like Troderians, who evolved under even harsher conditions, was humbling for many. Yet here we are," Husser gestured between them, "finding common ground despite our differences. Or perhaps because of them," Reynolds suggested. "Different evolutionary paths leading to complementary strengths and perspectives." As they emerged into Neuter's central plaza, the artificial night cycle was in full effect, simulated stars shining above the sprawling diplomatic complex. In the distance, Federation vessels of various designs moved through designated flight corridors, their navigation lights tracing patterns against the dark sky. "What happens tomorrow?" Husser asked. The Council will expect that framework document, and there will be political resistance to formalize any alliance between us. Tomorrow, Reynolds said with determination, we begin drafting that document. We identify areas of mutual benefit, address potential concerns, and build a case for cooperation that even the most nervous herbivore can't reasonably reject. And after that, Reynolds looked up at the artificial stars, then back to Husser. After that, we start exploring what two Deathworld species working together can accomplish. I suspect it will surprise everyone, including ourselves. Ysara approached them, having evidently heard the exchange. I, for one, look forward to joint combat exercises. The humans have fascinating techniques we could adapt to Trodarian physiology. And I'm eager to study how Trodarians process atmospheric toxins, Hagra added, joining them with Okafor. The applications for environmental adaptation technologies could benefit numerous species. Husser observed the easy interaction between the two delegations with a sense of wonder. Just hours ago, they had been strangers, potentially rivals for the same niche within Federation politics. Now, they were discussing collaborative future endeavors, as if they had been allies for years. I believe, he said finally, that the Federation has no idea what they've just witnessed. The beginning of something new. Reynolds agreed. Something they never anticipated when they classified our worlds as too dangerous and our species as too aggressive. They thought they were limiting us, Ysara said with a click of her mandibles. Instead, they gave us a reason to find each other. To the unexpected benefits of being underestimated, Blackwood offered, using a human gesture that Husser had learned was called a toast, even without beverages present. The two delegations parted that night with promises to reconvene the following day to begin work on their formal alliance proposal. As Husser watched the humans depart toward their quarters, he found himself reflecting on the strange path that had led to this moment. His species had always prided themselves on being unique, the only true Deathworlders in a galaxy of softer beings. That identity had shaped Trodarian politics, culture, and self-image for generations. Yet in discovering they were not alone, they had gained something potentially more valuable. Allies who truly understood the experience of evolving on a world that tried to kill you every day. Allies who, despite their different evolutionary paths, shared the determination and adaptability that came from surviving against overwhelming odds. Perhaps, Husser thought as he turned toward the Trodarian quarters, being one of two Deathworld species in the galaxy was actually better than being the only one. After all, even apex predators occasionally needed someone to watch their back. The formal signing of the Earth-Trodaria Cooperative Exchange Initiative took place 3 standard months after the incident at Everything Tavern. The ceremony was held in the Grand Chamber of the Federation Council, with representatives from all member species in attendance. Despite initial resistance from certain herbivore blocks, the carefully crafted framework document had addressed enough concerns about security and transparency to gain majority approval. The demonstration projects already underway, particularly joint research into cross-species medical treatments and environmental adaptation technologies, had helped sway many of the undecided delegations. As Husser stood beside Ambassador Reynolds at the ceremonial signing table, he reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The human delegation had expanded, now including specialists in various fields eager to collaborate with their Trodarian counterparts. Hagra had practically moved into a joint research facility, working alongside Dr. Okafor on comparative xenobiology studies that were already yielding promising results. Ysara and security specialist Blackwood had developed a joint training program that combined Trodarian strength techniques with human adaptive combat methods, creating a hybrid approach that maximized the advantages of both species. Most significantly, the perception of both humans and Trodarians within the Federation had begun to shift. While fear and caution remained common reactions, there was also growing interest and even respect. The demonstration that Deathworld species could cooperate rather than compete had challenged fundamental assumptions about predator psychology. Representatives of Earth and Trodaria, the Federation High Commissioner announced, "You may proceed with the formal signing." Husser and Reynolds each activated the authentication protocols on the document display, their biometric signatures recording a moment that would likely be remembered in galactic history. With this agreement, the Commissioner continued, "The Federation formally recognizes the Earth-Trodaria Cooperative Exchange Initiative as a legitimate bilateral program within Federation frameworks." Polite applause rippled through the chamber, tepid from some delegations, genuinely enthusiastic from others. The Melborian representatives remained conspicuously silent, still nursing grievances from the tavern incident. As they moved away from the signing table, Reynolds leaned slightly toward Husser. "Not bad for 3 months' work. When we first met, would you have predicted this outcome?" Husser clicked his mandibles in amusement. "I was more focused on proving that humans couldn't possibly be real Deathworlders. And now I recognize that the definition of Deathworld is perhaps more nuanced than we originally believed. Earth and Trodaria presented different evolutionary challenges, but both produced species capable of this moment." He gestured to the signed agreement. "Perhaps that's the true measure of a death world. Not just that it tries to kill you, but that it forges you into something capable of changing the galaxy." Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "I like that definition." The formal reception following the signing was held in a newly renovated chamber, the rebuilt Everything Tavern having declined to host any further diplomatic functions involving either humans or Trodarians. Unlike previous Federation gatherings, this one featured intentionally integrated seating arrangements, encouraging species to mix beyond their usual ecological groupings. "A small step," Hagara commented as they observed delegates cautiously navigating the new format, "but symbolic nonetheless." "Symbols matter in diplomacy," Reynolds agreed. "Speaking of which, I have something for you." He presented Husser with a small box crafted from what appeared to be Earth materials. Inside was a medallion featuring an artistic rendering of both Earth and Trodaria, orbiting a central star. The craftsmanship was impressive, with details that captured the distinctive features of both death worlds. "A token of appreciation from humanity," Reynolds explained. "The first of its kind, though we hope not the last." Husser accepted the gift with appropriate ceremony. The gesture is valued and reciprocated. He presented a Trodarian ceremonial dagger, its edge dulled for diplomatic purposes, but the symbolic significance intact. Traditionally given to those considered worthy hunting partners. The exchange drew attention from nearby delegates, with reactions ranging from approval to consternation depending on the species. The Venlaxian council member, passing nearby, paused to observe. "An interesting cultural exchange," the Venlaxian noted. "The council will be watching your initiative's progress with great interest." "We welcome the attention," Reynolds replied smoothly. "Transparency has been our commitment from the beginning." After the Venlaxian moved on, Ysara joined them, mandibles clicking in the pattern that indicated satisfaction. "The security provisions have been formally approved. Joint Trodarian human teams will be eligible for Federation peacekeeping missions starting next cycle." "That was faster than expected," Husser remarked. "The Security Council rarely moves quickly on such matters." "They had motivation," Blackwood explained, approaching with a datapad. 3 border disputes have escalated in the Outer Rim. The Council needs experienced combat specialists, and our joint teams are uniquely qualified. And they'd rather have us working for them than potentially causing problems elsewhere," Reynolds added with a knowing smile. "Practical politics," Husser acknowledged. "Perhaps not the idealistic foundation we envisioned, but a beginning nonetheless." As the reception continued, Husser found himself drawn into conversations with various delegates, many of whom seemed newly interested in Trodarian perspectives now that they were aligned with humans. It was a subtle shift in diplomatic dynamics, but a significant one. Later, as the formal event transitioned to more casual interaction, Husser found Reynolds alone on one of the observation balconies, looking out over Neuter's carefully designed landscape. "Second thoughts?" Husser asked, joining him at the railing. Reynolds shook his head. "Not about the alliance. Just contemplating the journey ahead. We've made a promising start, but there will be resistance, setbacks." Undoubtedly, change is rarely embraced immediately, especially by institutions as ancient as the Federation. True, but I find myself oddly optimistic. Reynolds turned to face him. Do you know what humans and Trodarians have in common beyond our Death World origins? Besides a tendency to get into bar fights? Husser asked dryly. Reynolds laughed. Besides that, we're both incredibly stubborn species. When we decide something is worth doing, we persist until it's accomplished, regardless of obstacles. A trait forged by worlds that constantly try to kill us, Husser observed. Exactly. And now, that stubbornness is aimed at reshaping how the Federation sees species like ours. Reynolds looked back at the gathering inside, where humans and Trodarians continued to mingle with representatives from dozens of worlds. I'd say the odds are in our favor. Husser followed his gaze, noting the subtle body language of various species. Curiosity overcoming caution, interest displacing fear. It was a small beginning but meaningful. You know, he said after a moment, there's a Trodarian proverb. Even the most dangerous predator sometimes needs a pack. We have something similar on Earth, Reynolds replied. Lone wolves rarely survive the winter. They stood in companionable silence, two representatives of worlds that had tried their best to kill them, united by that shared experience in ways neither could have anticipated. Below them, the carefully cultivated gardens of Neuter stretched out in orderly patterns, safe, controlled, predictable. So unlike the chaotic, challenging worlds that had shaped their species. To finding our pack, Reynolds said finally, in the most unexpected of places. Husser clicked his mandibles in the pattern of solemn agreement, into showing the galaxy what Deathworlders can accomplish, together. In the grand scheme of galactic politics, it was a small moment, two diplomats from different worlds sharing a quiet conversation on a balcony. But like many small moments, it contained the seeds of much larger changes to come. The Federation had classified their homeworlds as too dangerous, their species as too aggressive. They had been tolerated rather than embraced, feared rather than understood. But they had found each other. And in that unexpected connection between two apex species from worlds that tried to kill them, something new had begun. The Deathworlders had become allies. And the galaxy would never be quite the same again.